The founding of the Russian state dates back to the early 9th century, a time when various Slavic tribes inhabited the vast territories of Eastern Europe. The region was divided into numerous principalities, each with its own local leaders and customs. However, the unification of these disparate groups began when Viking settlers, led by Rurik, established a settlement in Novgorod around 862 AD. Rurik's successor, Oleg, expanded the territory southward to Kiev, where the first centralized political entity, Kievan Rus, took shape. Kievan Rus was influenced significantly by the Byzantine Empire, particularly through the adoption of Christianity in 988 AD by Prince Vladimir the Great. This religious conversion was a turning point, marking the integration of Eastern Orthodox Christianity into Russian culture and governance. Over the following centuries, Kievan Rus became a key hub of trade, art, and intellectual development, fostering early Russian culture. However, despite its prosperity, Kievan Rus began to decline by the 12th century, plagued by internal conflicts and invasions from nomadic tribes like the Cumans and later, the Mongols. Ultimately, the fall of Kievan Rus to the Mongol Empire in 1240 fragmented the once powerful state into smaller principalities, but the foundations laid during this period were crucial to the development of future Russian states. Kievan Rus emerged as the first centralized state in the region that would later become Russia, encompassing the modern territories of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The formation of Kievan Rus is attributed to the leadership of Viking settlers who arrived in the early 9th century. Rurik, the Varangian chieftain, established the first ruling dynasty, setting the stage for the future state. His successors, including Oleg and Igor, expanded the realm, bringing together various Slavic tribes and establishing a more unified political structure. One of the most significant achievements of Kievan Rus was its adoption of Christianity in 988 AD, under the rule of Prince Vladimir the Great. The decision to embrace Eastern Orthodox Christianity had a profound impact on the state's cultural, social, and political development. Influenced by Byzantine traditions, Kievan Rus adopted the Cyrillic script, Byzantine art, and religious practices, creating a distinctive Slavic Byzantine identity that remains significant in modern Russian culture. During its peak, Kievan Rus thrived as a major hub for trade and commerce. Located at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, it became a prosperous center for exchanging goods such as furs, spices, and agricultural products. The state's geographic position allowed it to develop strong economic ties with Western Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic world. Culturally, Kievan Rus was a vibrant society, producing notable achievements in art, literature, and architecture. Russian epic poetry, or bailani, originated during this period, reflecting the state's rich folklore and values. Structures such as the Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kiev exemplified the advanced architectural achievements that characterized this era. However, Kievan Rus faced challenges that weakened its unity over time. Political rivalries among the various principalities, along with internal disputes, led to fragmentation. The decline of the central authority became more pronounced in the 12th century, as local rulers increasingly sought independence. In the 13th century, the Mongol invasion brought a devastating blow to Kievan Rus. The sack of Kiev in 1240 marked the end of Kievan Rus as a unified state, leaving behind a legacy that would influence the future political landscape of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Mongol invasion of Russia had a profound and long-lasting impact on the history and development of the region. Beginning in the early 13th century, the Mongols, led by Bata Khan and his Golden Horde, swept across much of Eastern Europe, including the territories of Kievan Rus. This invasion was part of a larger wave of Mongol conquest that had already spread across Asia, creating the vast Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his descendants. The conquest of Kievan Rus began with the capture of Kiev in 1240, following which much of the Russian land fell under Mongol control. The Mongols, known for their advanced military tactics and brutal efficiency, imposed harsh demands on the defeated states. This period, often referred to as the Mongol Yoke, saw Russia subjected to Mongol tribute, taxation, and military dominance for over 2 centuries. The political and social consequences of the Mongol invasion were profound. The fragmentation that had begun during the decline of Kievan Rus was exacerbated as local rulers became vassals to the Mongol overlords. This division allowed the Mongols to maintain control over the region through puppet states, with key centers of influence like Moscow gradually rising to prominence. Moscow's rulers, particularly Ivan III, Ivan the Great, would later use this power to declare independence from the Mongols in the late 15th century. Culturally, the Mongol invasion introduced new elements into Russian society. While the Mongols did not impose their language or religion directly, their occupation introduced significant changes to governance, taxation systems, and military organization. Russian rulers adopted administrative practices from the Mongols, such as the use of a centralized bureaucracy to manage taxation and the military. Additionally, the period under Mongol rule saw increased trade routes that connected Russia more effectively with other regions, including Asia and the Islamic world. Economically, the Mongol domination disrupted earlier trade networks and agriculture. However, over time, Russian cities, particularly those like Novgorod and Moscow, began to rebuild their economies and strengthen local governance, paving the way for future independence. The Mongol invasion, despite its destruction and harsh rule, also set the stage for Russia's eventual unification and expansion. Moscow's rise as a powerful state with a central authority would become instrumental in shaping the future of a centralized Russia. The memory of the Mongol yoke would remain a defining narrative for Russian nationalism, seen as a period of struggle for sovereignty and resilience against foreign domination. The rise of Moscow in the 14th and 15th centuries marked a significant transformation in the political landscape of Russia. After the fall of Kievan Rus and the subsequent Mongol invasion, the fragmented Russian principalities struggled for dominance. Among these, Moscow emerged as the most powerful and strategically advantageous center, gradually consolidating power and laying the groundwork for the future Russian state. Moscow's ascent can be attributed to several factors. First, its location at the crossroads of major trade routes made it a hub for commerce and communication. Situated along the Moscow River, Moscow was relatively well-positioned for control over the surrounding territories, including regions as distant as Novgorod and Tver. The city's ability to serve as a center for economic and political activities enabled it to attract settlers and resources, which contributed to its growth and influence. Second, Moscow's leadership played a crucial role in its rise to power. The princes of Moscow, beginning with Ivan I Khalida, Ivan Moneybag, took advantage of the weakened state of neighboring principalities and the weakening influence of the Mongols. Ivan I, for instance, skillfully navigated relations with the Mongol overlords by maintaining tribute and securing the favor of the Golden Horde. This position allowed Moscow to gradually expand its control over neighboring territories. Ivan III, Ivan the Great, who ruled from 1462 to 1505, was instrumental in consolidating Moscow's dominance over the Russian lands. He challenged Mongol authority, formally breaking free from the Golden Horde's rule in 1480 during the standoff on the Ugra River. This victory was a turning point, as it symbolized Moscow's assertion of independence and the beginning of a new era in Russian history, the consolidation of the Russian state under Moscow's leadership. Ivan the Great also pursued aggressive territorial expansion, incorporating key regions such as Novgorod, Tver, and other principalities into the growing Muscovite state. His reign saw the construction of monumental structures, including the Grand Kremlin Palace and the development of Moscow as a political, religious, and cultural center. Furthermore, Ivan encouraged the centralization of power, reducing the autonomy of local rulers and aristocracy, thus reinforcing Moscow's dominance. Culturally, Moscow's rise was accompanied by the revival of Orthodox Christianity, which became deeply intertwined with the city's political identity. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had been a significant institution since the adoption of Christianity in Kievan Rus, saw its influence grow under Moscow's rule. The Church played a central role in fostering the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome, a successor to both Rome and Constantinople, serving as the spiritual and political leader of Orthodox Christians. Through a combination of strategic alliances, military conquests, and the centralization of power, Moscow solidified its position as the dominant force in Russia by the late 15th century. The city's rise laid the foundation for the emergence of the Tsardom of Russia and the eventual expansion of Moscow's influence far beyond the boundaries of the former Kievan Rus. The establishment of the Tsardom of Russia marked a significant turning point in the history of the Russian state. Following the decline of the Mongol influence and the consolidation of power by Moscow, Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, ascended to the throne in 1547. His reign marked the beginning of Russia's transformation from a collection of semi-autonomous principalities into a centralized, powerful state with ambitions for territorial expansion and modernization. Under Ivan IV, Russia expanded its borders considerably, incorporating vast regions into the Tsardom of Russia. Ivan's military campaigns in the north and east brought the incorporation of territories such as Siberia, the Volga region, and parts of the Caucasus. These territorial acquisitions greatly increased Russia's size and influence, positioning it as one of the largest states in the world. However, Ivan's rule was also marked by significant cruelty and the centralization of power, earning him the moniker Ivan the Terrible. One of the most notable aspects of Ivan IV's reign was the establishment of the opulent, a policy aimed at strengthening the autocratic rule by targeting the boyar aristocracy and anyone suspected of opposing his authority. The opulent led to mass executions, confiscation of lands, and the consolidation of control over the Russian nobility, fostering a more rigid and hierarchical state structure. While these policies helped suppress internal opposition, they also sowed deep mistrust and instability that would affect Russia for generations. Following Ivan IV's death in 1584, Russia entered a period of crisis, known as the Time of Troubles. This period saw political chaos, foreign invasions, and internal strife as various factions fought for control over the throne. The false Dmitry pretenders and foreign intervention from Poland and Sweden further weakened the state. Ultimately, the Romanov dynasty emerged as the solution to the turmoil, with Michael Romanov being elected Tsar in 1613, marking the beginning of the Romanov era. Under the Romanov Tsars, especially during the reigns of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, Russia made significant strides in modernization and expansion. Peter I, known for his extensive reforms, sought to bring Russia closer to Western Europe by transforming its military, economy, and administrative systems. His founding of St. Petersburg symbolized Russia's shift toward European influence, while the construction of a modernized navy and army helped Russia establish itself as a dominant power in European geopolitics. The Tsardom of Russia in this period saw not only territorial expansion, but also efforts to centralize and strengthen the state. The autocratic rule became even more pronounced, with the Tsar wielding supreme control over the government, the church, and the military. Nobility was required to serve the state in various capacities, reinforcing the idea of loyalty to the state above personal wealth or regional power. Throughout the 17th century, Russia's tsars expanded into Siberia, the Baltic region, and the Caucasus, solidifying its position as a major Eurasian empire. This era laid the foundation for Russia's role as a centralized, multi-ethnic empire, setting the stage for further expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries. The legacy of the Tsardom of Russia continues to influence the political and cultural identity of modern Russia. The Time of Troubles, spanning from the early 1590s to the early 17th century, was a period of intense political, social, and economic instability in Russia. Following the death of Tsar Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, in 1584, Russia was left without a clear line of succession. This created a power vacuum, which led to chaos as rival factions vied for control over the throne. The period is often described as one of deep crisis, marked by foreign invasions, internal rebellion, economic hardship, and the collapse of centralized authority. One of the key causes of the Time of Troubles was the ineffective governance of Ivan IV's successors. His son, Fyodor I, was incapable of ruling effectively, and after his death in 1598, the Rurik dynasty came to an end. This left Russia without a ruling dynasty, resulting in a period of interregnum, during which several pretenders claimed the throne. One of the most notable pretenders was false Dmitry I, who claimed to be the son of Ivan IV and sought to seize the throne. With the support of Polish and Catholic forces, false Dmitry I managed to occupy Moscow and establish a short-lived regime. However, this occupation only deepened divisions within Russian society, as many opposed foreign intervention and the establishment of Catholic influence in Russia. His reign was marked by chaos and ultimately ended in his assassination in 1606, plunging the country further into instability. During this time, Russia was also plagued by regional conflicts and internal rebellion. Cossack uprisings, peasant revolts, and boyar disputes further weakened the central authority. The economic situation worsened as widespread famine, plagues, and widespread unrest destabilized the countryside and urban centers alike. Moscow itself was besieged multiple times, with rival factions fighting for control over the capital, while foreign powers sought to exploit the power vacuum for their own advantage. The situation became so dire that in 1610, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth occupied Moscow and installed a puppet government. This occupation led to heightened fears of a Catholic takeover and sparked widespread national outrage, as many Russians saw the invasion as an existential threat to their Orthodox faith and cultural heritage. However, following a successful uprising led by a group of boyars and Cossacks, the Polish forces were eventually expelled from Moscow in 1612, which became a celebrated moment of national liberation. After several attempts to restore stability, the Russian nobles and representatives from various regions convened the Zemsky Sobor in 1613, a national assembly that played a crucial role in electing a new ruler. The assembly chose Michael Romanov, a young nobleman from the minor branch of the Romanov family, marking the beginning of the Romanov dynasty that would rule Russia for over 3 centuries. The time of troubles ultimately shaped the course of Russian history in profound ways. The period reinforced the importance of centralized power and autocratic rule, as the need for a strong, unified leadership became clear. The fear of internal strife and foreign domination drove the establishment of a more rigid and hierarchical state structure under the Romanovs, which would guide Russia through subsequent centuries of expansion and conflict. Despite the chaos, the time of troubles is remembered as a defining era that tested Russia's resilience and laid the groundwork for its future as a powerful empire. The Romanov dynasty, which began with the election of Michael Romanov in 1613, would rule Russia for over 3 centuries, shaping the country's political, social, and cultural landscape. The election of Michael Romanov followed the chaos of the time of troubles, a period marked by internal strife, foreign invasions, and the collapse of centralized authority. The selection of Michael marked the restoration of stability, and the Romanovs would go on to oversee significant changes, including territorial expansion, the centralization of power, and modernization efforts. The early Romanov period was dominated by the need to consolidate control and re-establish Moscow as the center of Russian governance. Michael Romanov, although relatively young and inexperienced, was seen as a unifying figure who could restore peace and order after the turmoil of the time of troubles. Under his reign, a series of reforms and policies were implemented to strengthen the state and rebuild its institutions. This era saw the strengthening of the Russian Orthodox Church's influence as it became closely intertwined with state affairs, which helped legitimize the monarchy's authority. During the 17th century, the Romanovs expanded Russia's territorial reach, incorporating regions such as Siberia, the Caucasus, and the Ukrainian territories. The conquest of Siberia under rulers like Ivan IV and Yermak Timofeyevich opened vast tracts of uncharted land, contributing to the rapid territorial growth of the Russian Empire. The expansion was driven by a combination of military conquests and settlement efforts, aimed at securing Russia's borders and increasing access to valuable resources such as fur, minerals, and agricultural land. Throughout the 18th century, the Romanovs sought to modernize and westernize Russia under influential tsars like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, was especially instrumental in transforming Russia into a more European-style state. His ambitious reforms included the establishment of a strong centralized government, the creation of a modern military, the adoption of Western technologies, and the founding of the new capital, St. Petersburg. Peter's efforts laid the foundation for Russia's emergence as a major European power. Catherine the Great, who ascended to the throne in 1762, further strengthened Russia's territorial dominance and pursued an aggressive policy of territorial expansion, particularly in the Black Sea region, Poland, and the Caucasus. Her reign is remembered for the patronage of the arts, education, and the establishment of Western-style institutions that helped shape Russian culture during the 18th century. Catherine's policies also included the further consolidation of serfdom, which reinforced the hierarchical structure of Russian society. The 19th century brought continued territorial expansion and the solidification of Russia's imperial ambitions. The Romanovs oversaw the incorporation of Central Asia, Alaska, and the expansion of the Russian Empire into the Baltic and Slavic territories. The era of Alexander I, Nicholas I, and Alexander II saw Russia play a significant role in European conflicts, such as the Napoleonic Wars and the Crimean War, while also striving to modernize its infrastructure and industrial base. Despite the successes of the Romanov dynasty in territorial expansion and modernization, internal tensions also persisted. Issues such as the growing influence of the nobility, the oppression of serfs, and dissatisfaction with the autocratic rule eventually led to the rise of revolutionary movements in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The repression of political dissent and the lack of meaningful reform created discontent that would culminate in the Russian Revolution of 1917, which ultimately brought an end to the Romanov dynasty and the monarchy. The Romanov dynasty left a lasting legacy on Russia's history, transforming it from a fragmented medieval state into a powerful empire with a distinct identity shaped by territorial expansion, centralized authority, and a fusion of Russian Orthodox and Western cultural influences. The 19th century marked a transformative period for Russia, characterized by industrialization, social reform, and efforts at modernization. Under the rule of tsars like Alexander I, Nicholas I, Alexander II, and Alexander III, Russia gradually sought to adapt to the rapidly changing political and economic landscape of Europe. Despite significant obstacles, including resistance from conservative factions and entrenched social hierarchies, the Russian Empire embarked on a course of modernization that shaped its trajectory for the 20th century. One of the most significant aspects of 19th century Russian modernization was industrialization. Although Russia lagged behind Western European powers in its industrial development, efforts to modernize the economy were evident, especially during the reign of Alexander II. In the mid-19th century, the Russian state began investing in infrastructure, such as railways, which were crucial for the movement of goods and people across vast territories. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, started in the 1890s, symbolized Russia's ambition to connect its remote regions and facilitate economic growth, trade, and military mobility. Additionally, industrialization saw the rise of factories, mining operations, and manufacturing industries. However, the pace of industrial development was uneven, with urban centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg experiencing more rapid growth than rural areas. Despite these efforts, the Russian economy remained predominantly agrarian, with a large portion of the population still working as serfs or peasants, tied to the land and vulnerable to harsh working conditions. The period also witnessed the emergence of a growing urban class and the development of a working class. However, social tensions were exacerbated by the inequalities between the wealthy nobility, the peasantry, and the newly emerging bourgeoisie. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 under Alexander II was a significant reform aimed at addressing social inequalities. While this step was seen as a move toward modernization, it did not solve the deep-seated issues of poverty, land ownership, and political disenfranchisement that plagued rural populations. Alexander II's reign was pivotal in implementing several reforms aimed at modernizing the Russian state. The establishment of local self-governance bodies, known as zemstvos, empowered regional communities, improving access to education, healthcare, and infrastructure in some areas. However, these reforms were limited and often met with resistance from conservative elements of the Russian aristocracy and bureaucracy, who feared a loss of their traditional privileges and influence. Another major area of modernization was the military. In response to Russia's defeats in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, significant reforms were carried out by figures such as Dmitry Miliutin, who introduced modern tactics, better training, and industrial advancements in military production. While these efforts aimed to build a more disciplined and efficient army, the military remained an extension of state power, reinforcing the autocratic rule of the tsars. Despite the strides made toward modernization, political reforms remained limited. The autocratic rule of the tsars persisted, with little to no political participation for the broader population. The lack of a representative government created widespread dissatisfaction, giving rise to political movements, including the rise of radical socialist ideas, populism, and the growth of the intelligentsia, who advocated for greater reform. The tensions between modernizing efforts and autocratic control created an unstable environment, which contributed to social unrest and paved the way for the eventual upheavals that culminated in the Russian Revolution of 1917. While 19th century industrialization and modernization set the stage for Russia's transition into the 20th century, they also highlighted the complexities and limitations of reform within an autocratic and largely rural society. The period of World War I and the subsequent Russian Revolution from 1914 to 1917 was a turning point in Russian history, marking the collapse of the Romanov dynasty and the transition to a new political order. World War I, which began with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, drew Russia into the conflict as an ally of France and the United Kingdom against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. However, Russia's involvement in the war revealed the weaknesses of its military, economic, and political systems, ultimately fueling widespread discontent that culminated in the Russian Revolution. One of the key issues that weakened Russia during World War I was its poorly developed industrial base and outdated military infrastructure. Despite efforts at modernization in the 19th century, Russia still lagged behind Western European powers in technological advancements and efficient governance. The Russian army faced logistical challenges, a lack of resources, and a high rate of casualties on the battlefield, which led to growing dissatisfaction among soldiers and civilians alike. The war exacerbated social inequalities and economic hardships. With much of the male workforce conscripted to fight, agricultural output declined, leading to food shortages and rising prices. The urban working class, peasants, and soldiers suffered under the strain of wartime inflation and inadequate supplies, which resulted in strikes, protests, and demonstrations across Russia. Furthermore, the inefficiency of the Russian government, led by Tsar Nicholas II, became increasingly apparent as the Tsar himself took command of the military in 1915, leaving the country's administration to his wife, Alexandra, and her controversial advisor, Grigory Rasputin. The political landscape during World War I was further complicated by the lack of political reform and the absence of a representative government. Russia remained an autocratic state, with the Tsar holding absolute power over the government and the military. The Duma parliament, created as part of earlier reforms, had limited influence and was unable to address the demands for broader social and political change. The lack of transparency and accountability from the ruling elite intensified public disillusionment. As the war dragged on, the Russian people grew more restless. Major events, such as the 1917 February Revolution, marked the turning point toward revolution. Protests and strikes began in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, in early February, driven by demands for food, better working conditions, and an end to the war. The movement quickly escalated into mass demonstrations, with women playing a prominent role, especially during International Women's Day on February 23rd. The protests were met with increasing violence from the military, but the unrest spread rapidly throughout the country. On March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, ending over 300 years of Romanov rule. A provisional government was established, with moderate leaders attempting to stabilize the situation and negotiate a path forward. However, the Bolshevik faction, led by Vladimir Lenin, began to gain support, advocating for radical reforms, including the withdrawal from World War I, redistribution of land to peasants, and the establishment of a socialist state. The provisional government struggled to maintain control as it faced resistance from both conservative forces and revolutionary movements. The lack of decisive action and the continued suffering of the Russian population undermined the legitimacy of the government. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks, who had been gaining momentum through their promises of immediate peace and radical social reforms, seized the opportunity to stage a successful coup in October 1917, marking the start of Soviet rule. The early 20th century was a transformative period for Russia, culminating in the establishment of the Soviet Union and the rise of communist ideology. Following the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent Civil War, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, consolidated power and established the Soviet state. This period saw the consolidation of a one-party communist regime, rapid industrialization, state control over economic and social life, and the expansion of Soviet influence across much of Eastern Europe and Asia. The Soviet Union was officially established in December 1922, with the Bolsheviks declaring a new socialist order based on Marxist-Leninist principles. The early years of the Soviet state were marked by intense political and social upheaval. Lenin's leadership set the tone for a centralized, authoritarian government that sought to reshape society according to communist ideals. The Communist Party, which held absolute power, controlled all aspects of political, economic, and cultural life. One of the primary goals of the Soviet government was to rapidly industrialize the country. To achieve this, the Soviet Union implemented ambitious five-year plans, which aimed to modernize the economy and transform agriculture and industry on a massive scale. These plans focused on heavy industry, infrastructure development, and technological advancements, while collectivization was enforced to consolidate agriculture under state control. Collectivization led to widespread resistance from peasants, causing widespread hardship, famine, and social disruption, particularly during the forced collectivization campaigns of the 1930s. The period also saw a campaign of political repression known as the Great Terror, spearheaded by Joseph Stalin after Lenin's death in 1924. The purges targeted perceived enemies of the state, including intellectuals, political rivals, military leaders, and ordinary citizens who were accused of disloyalty or counter-revolutionary activities. Millions of people were arrested, imprisoned, or executed, resulting in a climate of fear and mistrust throughout Soviet society. Culturally, the Soviet Union sought to promote socialist realism, a style of art and literature that glorified the values of the communist state and emphasized the importance of collective achievement and the proletariat. The government heavily controlled artistic expression, often suppressing dissenting views that did not conform to the ideals of the Communist Party. This era saw the development of state-run educational institutions, propaganda machines, and mass mobilization campaigns aimed at indoctrinating citizens with communist ideology. Internationally, the Soviet Union played a significant role in global politics. It sought to expand its influence through the establishment of communist parties and alliances across Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The USSR played a key role in the foundation of the Comintern, Communist International, which worked to promote world revolution and foster communist movements internationally. Tensions with capitalist countries, particularly the United States and Western Europe, grew during the Cold War era, leading to a period of geopolitical competition and rivalry between the Soviet bloc and the Western powers. The early Soviet period was also defined by the emergence of a bureaucratic state apparatus that controlled virtually every aspect of life. The Communist Party ruled with an iron grip, ensuring that loyalty was maintained through fear and repression. The government prioritized state security and ideological conformity over individual freedoms, which led to ongoing criticism of the oppressive nature of Soviet rule. Despite its many challenges, the Soviet Union expanded its influence throughout the 20th century, emerging as a global superpower with a focus on industrialization, military might, and ideological influence. The legacy of the early Soviet period continues to shape Russia's political and cultural identity, influencing its approach to governance, state control, and national pride. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked a significant turning point in Russian history, bringing an end to 7 decades of communist rule and state-controlled governance. The aftermath of the Soviet collapse ushered in a period of political, economic, and social transition as Russia embarked on a path of reform, liberalization, and reintegration into the global community. However, this transition was fraught with challenges, including political instability, economic hardship, and a shifting balance of power between state and society. In the immediate aftermath of the Soviet Union's dissolution, Russia experienced a chaotic period of economic reform under President Boris Yeltsin. The transition to a market economy was accompanied by privatization of state assets, a dramatic decline in industrial production, and hyperinflation. The rapid dismantling of state enterprises led to mass unemployment, poverty, and social inequality. While Western-style reforms were implemented, they often deepened existing disparities and left a significant portion of the population struggling to adapt. Yeltsin's presidency saw the strengthening of presidential powers in the face of a fragmented political landscape, where rival factions vied for control over the state apparatus. This period was marked by a weakened parliament, ineffective governance, and corruption at multiple levels of government. Additionally, the 1990s were marked by instability in Russia's regions, with separatist movements in places like Chechnya challenging Moscow's authority. The 2000s, under President Vladimir Putin, marked a significant shift in Russia's domestic and foreign policy. Putin's leadership saw a resurgence of state power and a strong centralization of authority, effectively rolling back many of the liberal reforms of the Yeltsin era. His tenure focused on re-establishing Russia as a global power, both economically and politically, through a combination of energy exports, military modernization, and a more assertive foreign policy. Putin's rule introduced policies aimed at stabilizing the economy and increasing state control over strategic industries, such as natural resources and finance. During this period, Russia experienced economic growth driven by the energy sector, particularly oil and gas exports, which accounted for a significant portion of the national budget. However, this growth came with authoritarian tendencies, as the Kremlin sought to consolidate power, suppress dissent, and control media narratives. Political opposition was increasingly marginalized, and civil society faced restrictions, limiting public participation in governance. Putin's leadership was characterized by a nationalist approach that sought to restore Russia's status as a great power. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 following the crisis in Ukraine marked a significant turning point in Russian foreign policy, as Moscow directly challenged Western influence in the region. This move, coupled with military interventions in Syria and increasing involvement in Eastern Europe, positioned Russia as a more aggressive geopolitical player on the world stage. In recent years, the political climate in Russia has continued to evolve, with the state maintaining a stronghold over institutions, media, and civil liberties. While some economic reforms have been implemented, the reliance on a centralized state, coupled with state control of key industries, has created challenges for sustainable development and long-term growth. At the same time, Russia faces demographic challenges, such as an aging population and low birth rates, which pose obstacles to future prosperity. Despite its challenges, Russia remains a significant global power with a complex relationship with the West, influenced by historical tensions and current geopolitical conflicts. The legacy of the Soviet Union continues to shape Russia's identity, both domestically and internationally, as the country navigates a rapidly changing world. The 21st century has seen Russia reasserting its influence, balancing modernization with authoritarian governance, while grappling with both internal reform pressures and external pressures from global powers. In recent years, Russia has faced a variety of complex challenges, both domestically and internationally. From political instability and economic reform to social inequality and global relations, Russia has been navigating a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape while striving to maintain its influence as a global power. These challenges are deeply rooted in Russia's history, but have been amplified by modern developments, including the impact of globalization, economic crises, and internal social unrest. One of the most pressing issues in contemporary Russia is political stability and governance. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian state has evolved from a communist one-party system to a more modern, albeit authoritarian, governance structure. However, political repression, censorship, and limited civil liberties persist. The Russian government has been criticized for suppressing political dissent, targeting opposition leaders, and controlling media through state influence and legal measures. Opposition figures, journalists, and activists often face harassment, imprisonment, or exile for voicing criticism of the government or challenging its policies. Corruption remains a significant issue in Russia's political and economic system. Despite various anti-corruption campaigns, the prevalence of graft and misuse of power has deep roots, with state institutions often serving elite interests. The opaque nature of decision-making and the concentration of power within a small group of oligarchs and government officials has led to widespread public dissatisfaction and reduced trust in institutions. In many cases, economic policies are driven by the interests of a privileged few, while ordinary citizens struggle with limited access to basic services, justice, and opportunities for upward mobility. Economically, Russia continues to face the challenge of diversifying its economy beyond its reliance on natural resources. Although the energy sector, particularly oil and gas, has been a significant driver of economic growth, fluctuations in global commodity prices have exposed Russia's vulnerabilities. Sanctions imposed by Western countries in response to geopolitical conflicts, such as the annexation of Crimea and involvement in Ukraine, have further strained the Russian economy, contributing to financial instability and inflation. Additionally, slow economic reform and state intervention have hindered the development of a competitive and innovative private sector, slowing progress toward modernization and sustainable development. Social inequality is another critical issue in contemporary Russia. The disparity between the urban elite and rural populations remains stark, with rural areas suffering from underdevelopment, poor infrastructure, and limited access to quality education and healthcare. Wealth is concentrated in a small percentage of the population, while much of the working class and lower-income groups face economic hardships, limited access to social welfare, and reduced prospects for social mobility. Marginalized communities, including ethnic minorities and the LGBTQ+ community, continue to face discrimination, exacerbating social tensions and limiting their full participation in society. Russia's relationship with the international community is also a major concern. Tensions with Western nations have intensified in recent years due to geopolitical conflicts, cyber attacks, and allegations of interference in democratic processes in Europe and the United States. The annexation of Crimea and military actions in Ukraine have strained relations with the European Union and the United States, resulting in sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and reduced economic cooperation. Russia's foreign policy has become increasingly assertive, using soft power tactics such as information warfare, propaganda, and support for authoritarian regimes, which further contributes to global polarization. Additionally, demographic challenges pose a significant obstacle to Russia's future growth. Russia is experiencing a declining birth rate and an aging population, which threatens to impact economic productivity and increase the strain on social services. Migration issues are also prominent, with a significant proportion of young Russians seeking opportunities abroad due to limited job prospects, political repression, and lack of personal freedoms at home. Despite these challenges, Russia continues to maintain a strong national identity, shaped by its history as a multi-ethnic, diverse, and influential power. While the road ahead may be difficult, Russia's trajectory remains a subject of intense global interest, with both internal reforms and external relations continuing to play a critical role in shaping its future. In recent years, Russia has also faced challenges related to environmental sustainability and the impacts of climate change. As one of the largest producers of greenhouse gases, Russia plays a significant role in global environmental issues. However, despite recognizing the need for sustainable development, progress has been slow due to inadequate infrastructure, bureaucratic hurdles, and a lack of public awareness. Issues such as deforestation, pollution, and the degradation of natural habitats pose significant threats to Russia's biodiversity and its ability to address the long-term impacts of climate change. The COVID-19 pandemic further exposed weaknesses in Russia's healthcare system, which has long struggled with underfunding, limited access to quality services, and corruption. During the pandemic, the healthcare sector was overwhelmed, with healthcare workers reporting shortages of resources, outdated equipment, and insufficient government support. The Russian government has made efforts to modernize the healthcare system, yet concerns remain about the quality of medical services, regional disparities, and the need for long-term systemic reform. On the global stage, Russia has continued to assert its influence through strategic partnerships with countries such as China and India, while also expanding its economic and geopolitical ties with countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Through initiatives like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and involvement in the BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Russia seeks to diversify its influence beyond Western Europe and the United States. These partnerships are often centered on economic development, energy cooperation, and counterbalancing Western dominance in international institutions. However, maintaining Russia's global influence requires navigating complex challenges, including balancing competing interests, managing regional conflicts, and responding to Western sanctions. The ability to adapt to shifting geopolitical alliances and maintain internal stability while addressing external pressures remains a critical challenge for Russia's leadership. Despite these hurdles, there are signs of resilience and a desire for innovation within Russian society. Growing movements for civic engagement, cultural revival, and grassroots activism indicate a push for greater openness and democratic reforms, albeit facing significant resistance from the state. Additionally, a younger generation is increasingly turning to digital platforms to express dissent and mobilize around issues such as political reform, social justice, and environmental concerns. In conclusion, Russia's contemporary challenges reflect both the enduring legacy of its imperial and Soviet past and the complexities of navigating a rapidly changing world. The balance between maintaining national security, economic stability, and political control while fostering social equity and modernization continues to shape Russia's path forward. As Russia grapples with these multifaceted issues, its future will depend on how effectively it addresses these challenges while remaining engaged with the broader global community.